Good morning to everyone in Australia and good afternoon to the New Zealanders. Welcome to this webinar presented jointly on behalf of the Australian Auditing and Assurance Board and the New Zealand Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. My name is Sylvia van Dijk. I am the Director of Assurance Standards at the External Reporting Board. Presenting with me today from across the Tasman is Matthew Sapula. He is the Technical Director of the AUASB, and Renee Harmon and Tim Austin, the Technical Director of the AUASB with Renee Harmon and Tim Austin, also from the AUASB. So you can see it's a true trans-Tasman joint event with lots of different voices and, of course, accents to hopefully assist in keeping you awake while listening to this riveting subject. As we change over from me presenting from Wellington to the Aussies in Melbourne, please bear with us as there may be a slight delay during the transfer. Today, we will give you an overview of the 3 quality management standards recently issued by the IAASB, that is the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. To provide some context, we will start off with a short introduction on the history of the project to revise the quality control standards, including the issues identified through outreach and the IAASB's proposals. We're hoping the presentation will motivate you to attend one of the other outreach events we are planning, which we will tell you about at the end of this show. The EDs are proposing significant changes for the way your firm manages quality, and we really want your feedback about how workable these proposals are for you. Please submit your questions as we go along. If we do have time at the end, we will cover some of them. However, we do have quite a few slides to cover over 1.5 hours, so we will just have to see where we get to. If we don't have time to address your questions, we will send out the answers to everyone within the next couple of days. Now, a quick overview of the project history. After the global financial crisis, many companies responded to the changing environment and emerging corporate governance risks by revisiting their business practices and relevant activities. Questions have arisen about whether the extant international standard on quality control, ISQC1, remains fit for purpose, given the evolving environment in which firms operate, the intensifying focus on quality, and the increasing expectations of firm stakeholders. Furthermore, the findings from the post-implementation review of the clarified ISIS, the inspection findings, and ongoing outreach from 2013 have suggested that several aspects of extant ISQC1 could be more robust and that additional action is needed to address the proportional application of the standard by small and medium-sized practitioners, or SMPs. You may recall that the IAASB consulted on issues in 2015 to 2016 in the ITC addressing professional skepticism, quality control, and group audits. Now, in December 2016, the IAASB approved the project proposal to amend ISQC1 and ISA 220 to address the issues identified by the public consultation in 2015 and 2016. Now, the issues identified through the public consultation related to the firm governance and leadership responsibilities and accountability for quality, the firm's monitoring process, that is, monitoring the entire system and not just completed assignments, addressing results of external inspections, understanding the root causes, monitoring the effectiveness of remedial actions. Also, issues about clarity needed about the engagement partners' responsibilities. There was concern about undue reliance on quality controls with network firms. There's increasing demand for communication with external stakeholders, issues relating to the scalability of the standards, and to engagement quality control reviews, such as the engagement subject to review, eligibility of the EQ reviewer, and areas addressed in the review. Other issues identified were the need for two-way communication within the firm, human resource matters, and the increasing use of alternative delivery models. So you can see it's quite a challenging list. To address the issues identified, the IAASB issued 3 EDs in February 2019. ED ISQM1, Quality Management for Firms that perform audits or reviews of financial statements or other assurance engagements or related services engagement. This ED addresses quality management at the firm level. ED ISQM2, that's a new standard on engagement qualities review, and then revised ED ISA 220, Quality Management for an Audit of Financial Statements, that addresses quality management at the engagement level. The IAASB also released a covering explanatory memorandum that addresses the relationship between the standards and other overall matters, such as the possible effective dates. Now, comments are due to the IAASB on 1 July 2019. Now, you can respond directly to the IAASB on its proposals by that date, or in New Zealand to the New Zealand Auditing and Assurance Standards Board by 7 June 2019 to inform the submission of the NZAUSB to the IAASB. Matthew Zappola will tell you a bit later about the submission process in Australia. The details about the submission process can be found on both the XRB and the AUASB websites. The IAASB is intending to approve the standards in March 2020, with Public Interest Oversight Board approval expected in June 2020. The proposed effective date is 18 months after PIB approval, which will give an effective date of December 2021. Early adoption is permitted, but given the interrelationships of the standards, all 3 will need to be adopted at the same time. Now, for most firms, this would result in a significant change in practice, particularly with ISQM1. But some larger firms may already have implemented a risk-based approach to quality. There is a specific question in the explanatory memorandum about the implementation date and implementation support needed. Now, this slide is meant to illustrate the integrated nature of the 3 proposed quality management standards, and not that they are puzzling. Although a new quality management approach has been introduced in ED ISQM1, the nature and spirit of the relationship between ED 220 and ED ISQM1 has not changed. The firm is responsible for establishing its system of quality management, which provides the foundation for management quality at the engagement level, and the engagement partner is responsible for managing and achieving quality at the engagement level. Now, given the importance and value placed on the role of the engagement quality review by stakeholders, particularly investors and regulators, and on feedback received in the outreach conducted, a separate standard has been developed for engagement quality reviews. As a result, the requirements in extant ISA 220 dealing with the responsibilities of engagement quality control reviewer have been removed from ED 220 and revised and reallocated to ED ISQM2. The covering explanatory memorandum addresses the relationships between standards, and we will also touch on this during our presentation. I'm now going to hand you over to my Australian colleagues to tell you more about ED ISQM1. Please bear with us as there might be a slight delay as we transfer to Melbourne.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Renee Herman and I'm a Senior Project Manager at the AUASB here in Melbourne, Australia. The first ED that we will cover this morning is ISQM1, previously ISQC1. For New Zealanders, PES3 for assurance practitioners, with PS1 issued by CAANZ dealing with quality control for other engagements. In Australia, the equivalent standard is ASQC1. The most significant change is for firms to have a risk-based approach to managing quality, scalable to the nature and circumstances of the firms and engagements it performs. The essence of the new approach is to focus firms' attention on risks that may have an impact on engagement quality. Unlike extant ISQC1, which was viewed as a very checklist-based standard, the new approach requires a firm to customize the design, implementation, and operation of its system of quality management based on the nature and circumstances of a firm and the engagements that it performs. For example, a firm that only performs compilations of financial statements may not identify quality risks relating to independence, because the relevant ethical requirements that are applicable to that firm may not include requirements addressing independence when performing a compilation engagement. The new approach also requires the firm to transition from policies and procedures that address standalone elements, as is required by extant ISQC1, to an integrated approach that reflects upon the system as a whole. Hence the name change from the International Standard on Quality Control to the International Standard on Quality Management. The objective of a firm is to design, implement, and operate a system of quality management. The objective of a system of quality management is to provide the firm with reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the objectives. And reasonable assurance is obtained through the operation of the system as a whole, and this approach is similar to other risk management and governance frameworks. The IASB Code requires a professional accountant to act in the public interest, and the IAASB believes that the public interest is served by the consistent performance of quality engagements, which is the purpose of the system of quality management. Unlike ISQC1, EDISQM1 explicitly requires the firm to exercise professional judgment in applying the requirements of the standard. Doing so is necessary so that a firm's system of quality management is appropriately tailored to the nature and circumstances of the firm and the engagements that it performs. The need to exercise professional judgment is reinforced through the standard, and a definition of professional judgment has been introduced. One of the most significant public interest issues is fostering an independent and challenging skeptical mindset of an auditor. Many aspects of a firm's system of quality management support the exercise of professional skepticism at the engagement level. For example, the culture and tone from the top should promote the importance of audit quality and the need to exercise professional skepticism. Allocating appropriate resources may prevent impediments to professional skepticism, such as limited time or knowledge or experience. So given the pervasive effect of a system of quality management on supporting professional skepticism at the engagement level, EDISQM1 does not specifically highlight which aspects of the system will support professional skepticism. However, an emphasis on professional skepticism at the engagement level has been made in the introductory section of the ED and the engagement performance component. So what is this new approach to quality management? A system of quality management is a continual and iterative process and is responsive to changes in the nature and circumstances of a firm and its engagements. The components of the system of quality management are highly integrated, and the system does not operate in a linear manner. For example, Resources is an essential aspect that enables the operation of each of the other components of the system of quality management. Some of the components have been retained from the extant, some are new or adapted, and it is these new or adapted ones that we will focus on today. Those being governance and leadership, the risk assessment process, we'll call it the RAP, resources, information and communication, and monitoring and remediation. It's really important to note that while the ED is organized according to these 8 elements, firms are not required to organize their systems according to these discrete components. The ED's only requirement is that the firm meets all the requirements of the standard in designing, implementing, and operating its system of quality management. For example, provided that all the requirements of the standard are still met, a firm may well have different names for the components, may combine them, or may in fact have additional components. Let's look at the governance and leadership component now. Firm governance is not specifically addressed in the extant standard, and there's not much detail about what is expected from leadership in relation to firm governance. The IAASB considers that it's of paramount importance, and hence you'll see it's placed it first in the diagram. It's the roof of the house. It's the way a firm embeds its culture and ethics and self-regulates, and it serves as the framework for how firm decisions will be made. Governance and leadership also affects the public perceptions of a firm. It has been substantially enhanced from the extant to improve robustness of governance and leadership. For example, there are enhanced requirements to address the culture of the firm and the focus on quality, and extending the culture throughout the firm by explicitly addressing the responsibility of all personnel for quality, requiring leadership to demonstrate a commitment to quality through their actions and behaviours, and to establish the expected behaviour of personnel. There are enhanced and more explicit responsibilities and accountability of firm leadership, with enhanced requirements for the necessary attributes of leadership, and a new requirement that addresses the performance evaluations of leadership. There is a new requirement that addresses the linkage between a firm's strategic decisions and actions and quality, and this includes the firm's role in serving the public interest. There are new requirements addressing the firm's organizational structure, appropriate assignments of roles and responsibilities and authority. For example, there's a requirement to assign ultimate responsibility for the system and operational responsibility for the system as a whole, independence, monitoring, and remediation. There's also a new requirement that addresses overall planning, obtaining, allocating, assigning resources at the firm leadership level. The ED is more explicit about who is responsible for understanding this ED ISQM1. For example, how much are you required to understand where you are delegating responsibility to other individuals within the firm who support leadership? And this is particularly the case at large firms. It is impractical in some instances for those with overall responsibility of the system to have an in-depth understanding of every aspect of the standard. Accordingly, the ED requires these individuals to have an understanding of ISQM1 relevant to their responsibilities. Let's have a look at the firm's risk assessment process, the RAP, and what does the firm's RAP actually entail? So this is a new approach that focuses the firm's attention on risks that may have an impact on engagement quality. The ED includes a component, the firm's risk assessment process, which comprises the process that a firm is required to follow in implementing a risk-based approach to quality management. The firm's risk assessment process, the RAP, is applied to the other 7 components of the system of quality management. That is, the firm is required to use this approach in establishing quality objectives, identifying and assessing quality risks, and designing and implementing responses for the other 7 components. The first step in the RAP is to establish quality objectives. The quality objectives established by the firm consist of objectives that, when achieved by the firm, collectively provide the firm with reasonable assurance that the objectives of the system of quality management are achieved. And this slide shows the relationship between the quality objectives, the objective of the system of quality management, and the overall objective of the standard itself. The ED includes quality objectives that all firms are required to establish. The quality objectives are outcome-based, and how they are achieved is determined by the firm, and this improves the scalability of the standard. The IAASB is of the view that the quality objectives within ISQM1 are comprehensive, and if properly addressed by a firm, will result in the system providing reasonable assurance that its objectives have been achieved. However, the IAASB recognises that the nature and circumstances of firms and the engagements that they perform vary, and this may give rise to the need for the firm to establish additional quality objectives beyond those that are set out in the standard to achieve the objective of the standard. Accordingly, the firm is required to establish additional quality objectives beyond those required by the standard when those objectives are necessary. However, the IAASB does not anticipate that in every circumstance, every firm will need to establish additional quality objectives. Following on from establishing those quality objectives, the next step of the RAP is to identify and assess quality risks that may affect the achievement of those quality objectives. Now, unlike the quality objectives, the ED does not identify quality risks that are applicable for all firms. So the standard gives the quality objectives, but not all the quality risks. The firm is expected to identify and assess its own quality risks for quality, taking into account the nature and circumstances of the firm and the engagement that it performs. As a result, the quality risks identified and assessed by the firm are customized and tailored for that firm. And the IAASB considers that specifying quality risks in the standard would likely drive a checklist approach to implementing the standard, which is contrary to the new quality management approach. The IAASB recognises that it is not reasonable or practical for a firm to identify and assess every possible risk, and to identify and implement responses for every possible risk. So the ED has introduced a process for identifying and assessing quality risks, and this is really a 2-step process. Step 1 is identifying the quality risks that meet a described threshold, and this is based on a preliminary consideration of the reasonable possibility of the quality risks occurring and their effect on the achievement of the quality objectives. And step 2, assessing those identified quality risks, which involves now a more detailed consideration of the degree of the likelihood of the quality risk occurring and the significance of the effect of the identified quality risk on the achievement of those objectives. So this slide really demonstrates step 2 of the process, and this is where the identified risk is assessed for the likelihood and magnitude. The purpose of assessing a quality risk is to assist the firm in designing and implementing responses, because the reasons for the assessment of the quality risks affect the nature, timing, and extent of audit responses, or any responses actually. The IAASB acknowledges that in some instances, these 2 steps may be undertaken concurrently, but the firm is not expected to assess every single quality risk. The firm is only expected to assess those risks that reach the threshold criteria. The third step in the process, the third step in the RAP process, is to design and implement responses that address the quality risks in order that the quality objectives are achieved. The definition of response is policies or procedures designed and implemented by the firm. Now, the IAASB has used the term responses purposefully instead of controls or policies, because this emphasizes the importance of responding to risks and the proactive nature of the new quality management approach. As explained before, the standard includes quality objectives that are comprehensive and, if properly addressed by the firm, will result in the system providing reasonable assurance that its objectives have been achieved. EDISQM1 includes some responses that all firms are required to design and implement, but it is important to note that the responses are not comprehensive, given the varying nature and circumstances of the firms and the engagements that they perform. For example, the resources component does not include any required responses. The standard is explicit that the firm is required to design and implement responses to address the assessed quality risks in addition to responses required by the standard. Although these responses are required by the standard, the firm tailors them and takes that into account when assessing the quality risks that the responses address, as well as the nature and circumstances of the firm and the engagements that it performs. The engagement quality review is an example of a response to an assessed quality risk. An EQR is a firm-level response to an assessed quality risk, and it is implemented by the EQR reviewer on behalf of the firm to be performed in accordance with ISQM1. And we'll go through a bit more later on the requirements in ISQM2 when we cover that ED. ISQM1, however, sets out the circumstances under which an EQR should be performed. The ED proposes an enhanced scope of engagement subject to EQR, i.e., in addition to listed entities and other entities, the firm determines are of significant public interest. And this will need consideration in local jurisdictions, Australia and New Zealand, as to how this enhanced scope may in fact operate and what this means for us locally. I'm going to pass over to Matthew, who will take you through some of the other new and adapted components of the house.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, Sylvia, for the earlier introduction. They've both done a fantastic job taking you through the elements of the standard thus far. And to be fair, I think Renee's probably taken you through the main elements, particularly the new risk-based approach. My section is nowhere near as exciting. I'm taking you through the last little parts of the house, a lot of which are driven from the excellent requirements of the existing standards, but I'll take you through where the changes have happened. So the resources area is pretty much adapted from the extant standards that you all use. There's a new requirement in there around the use of technological resources, acknowledging that obviously a lot of the system of quality management now is managed by a firm. It uses different types of technologies, but that's still very principles-based, acknowledging the fact that technologies evolve over time and different firms will use different technologies in different ways. So That's a new requirement, but it's a very basic principles requirements. The other key element resources is what they refer to as intellectual resources. And again, that's implied but not explicitly addressed in the existing ISQM standards or the previous standards. The new principles requirement in this area has been added so that when the firm obtains or develops, implements and maintains appropriate intellectual resources, it ensures consistent performance of quality engagements, and that the appropriate intellectual resources are maintained consistently with professional standards and the applicable legal and regulatory requirements. So there's no explicit required responses to this particular component. There is, however, the general requirement to set objectives, identify risks on a firm specific basis. If I move to the next phase or the next section of the ISQM standard, that covers information and communication. This has been considerably updated compared to the extant version of the standard. The extant version doesn't really address the broader need for communication and information across the whole system and also with engagement teams. And Tim will come in and talk about ISO 220 in a little while, and you'll see how the different standards interact with each other, acknowledging that the requirement exists in ISQM 1 for the firm to set up all the necessary information and communication activities, but ISO 220 also talks about how at the engagement level the engagement team needs to address and interact with those firm-wide requirements. So the new exposure draft includes new requirements that require the firm to establish an information system, emphasise the need for effective two-way communication across the firm, and the responsibility for all personnel for communication, not just those who work in the quality area or at the engagement leader level. There's also new requirements that support the firm addressing the need for robust communication and interaction throughout the performance of engagements, which was a key public interest issue highlighted that the ISSB received feedback on when they were going through the development of this standard. There's also a requirement now around information and communication when you're dealing with external parties. And again, this is something that wasn't previously covered in the extant standard. So for example, a lot of firms provide information around their quality performance or quality systems on their website, or there's requirements in different territories to do things like transparency reports or another mechanism which actually promotes quality within the firm or reports on the quality results externally. So there are new requirements in the ED for ISQM1 in respect of dealing with external parties and making sure that that's adaptable considering the circumstances of the firm, acknowledging the different jurisdictional requirements that exist when it comes to this matter, particularly different requirements of regulators, etc. So the requirement in the standard requires the firm to evaluate what external parties they either need to communicate with or what communications they get from external parties and how they address those. I'd say to you that the standard in this area has some specific principles, but then quite a lot of application guidance, acknowledging that this is an area that is quite different across different areas of the globe. So there was some debate at the ISSB level as to having more explicit requirements in this area. You'll see that the exposure draft has scaled back the requirements, but the corresponding application guidance is quite detailed to reflect the fact that there are a lot of issues to consider. I'll move to the final part of the ISQM framework, which is monitoring and remediation, sorry. Now, this looks like a fairly busy slide, but actually if you go through it, it's actually pretty straightforward. And this is one of the areas where, again, the extant standard was actually quite good. It was quite explicit around what needed to be required. And unlike the other areas, which take a very, very qualitative-based approach, in the monitoring and remediation area, there are a lot more, I'll call, compliance elements of the ED. They've been retained from the extant, reflecting the fact that this is something that was already addressed quite comprehensively in the existing versions of the quality management standards. And also, when there was an initial, going through the drafting process, the ISSB pushed initially for a more qualitative risk-based approach to this area, and the feedback they got from the regulatory community was, no, we need to have explicit requirements in this area. So, when you're evaluating the exposure drafts yourself and providing feedback, that might be something you might want to think about as to whether or not you're happy with where the exposure draft has landed. So the overall objective of this section, the monitoring and remediation section, is to determine whether the specific quality objectives in this area have been achieved, and they are highlighted in the slide there. There's the monitoring activities, the external inspection activities, and then other types of activities, particularly other forms of information that need to be considered when it comes to the monitoring and remediation of the firm's performance. In the context of this slide, it's quite it looks like a linear process on the slide, but actually, if you read the standard, there's quite a lot of words in there, particularly a lot of application guidance. So this slide is really designed to at least give you a visual simplification of how it actually works. And if you think about it, you basically decide, well, what are you doing about the negative findings, and then whether those negative findings lead to a deficiency, and what you then do about those deficiency what you do about that deficiency within the quality management system or system of quality management that the firm has, and breaking that down even further, doing a root cause analysis and then determining what the remediation activities are. Again, a lot of firms, through their own existing systems of quality management, would already have robust systems and processes in place where they actually do this. The new requirements in ISQM1 go into a bit more detail around, making sure that this is actually something that firms are doing. And secondly, again, the application guidance is a lot more detailed. The other thing that's new in the requirements in ISQM1 is there's actually a requirement now to consider the positive findings as well. So what are you doing about positive findings from quality reviews and quality management processes, making sure that they're being appropriately communicated and built into the systems and processes of a particular firm. So look, just at a very high level, there's increased emphasis on tailoring the monitoring activities based on the firm's circumstances. One other thing that's come through the new requirements is the extant standard solely deals with completed engagements, whereas obviously now a lot of firms, as part of their quality management systems, are putting in place real-time or on-the-job quality systems and processes. So acknowledging that that's now a very effective form of measuring and maintaining quality, that's in there. There's a specific clarification between findings and deficiencies. So acknowledging that not all findings are directly a deficiency associated with the system of quality control. Findings may be due to random factors. Basically, obviously there's still an element of human error or human consideration that needs to go into these considerations. So the previous extant standard really made it quite clear that whenever you had a finding, then you had to go and investigate the cause and implement remedial actions. Now there's an acknowledgement that sometimes things just happen. So it gives you a bit of more clarity around the difference between a finding and a deficiency and what the expectation is when it comes to a deficiency. So specifically, the firm is now required to look at the root causes of deficiency so that appropriate action can be taken. And very quickly here, I might just put in a plug for the recent materials that the CAANZ and CPA Australia have put out, where they've actually put out a root cause analysis guide for firms in Australia, which obviously can be used on both sides of the Tasman. So there is a number of resources that you can use to address this. And I suspect as ISQM1 becomes a reality, then there'll be even more materials coming out. The final part of the monitoring and remuneration section, which is important, is that there's stronger, robust requirements now for the responsibilities of firm leadership. So specifically a requirement that the leadership is effectively signing off on the effectiveness of the remedial actions and an evaluation annually of whether or not the actual system is operating effectively. So to summarise this section, as I said, the requirements, the objectives are really not different from the point of view of the extant standard, but the individual elements, they've gone into a bit more detail. And as I said, unlike some of the other sections of the system quality management, which really do flow from the qualitative approach and risk-based approach that Renee's taken through, this section is a bit more compliance focused by nature of the type of information that's being addressed. Now, I mentioned the specifics of that it's gone through a lot more detail around how you determine whether a deficiency exists and then what the response to deficiencies should be. Just quickly on this slide, this mirrors the framework that you saw on a previous slide that Renee put up when she was talking through how the quality objective, quality risks and responses are structured. In reality, I mean, I looked at this slide, and which we sourced from the IASB, and I said, that looks quite complex. And then when I actually read through the detail, it's actually pretty simple. If you think about it, at the first level, on the far right-hand side, you've got a deficiency if you're missing a particular quality objective. So if your system quality management doesn't, is basically totally blank when it comes to a specific objectives. You also have a deficiency if you haven't identified the quality risks appropriately. And then you also have a deficiency if the response to that deficiency is either missing or is inadequate. So essentially, deficiencies can happen at any level of the hierarchy. Obviously, the nature and assessment of deficiency will depend on how the firm has defined its system of quality control and what the various elements of the responses and risks, etc., as a result of that. Again, it's not meant to be it's meant to, the new requirements are meant to give the firms flexibility, reflecting the fact that each firm will have a different system of quality control, so therefore the nature of deficiencies will differ over time. Okay, so to wrap things up for me, the other piece of the puzzle that didn't exist very well in the extant versions of the standard was when a firm is relying on network and service providers. So let's deal with networks first. So obviously, a lot of our firms operate within agreements of international or national firms, and therefore you rely on the systems of quality control or quality management that have been established as part of that firm. In some cases, it'll obviously be part of the firm's agreement that you have to comply with those requirements. The existing standard didn't explicitly address that. It really only dealt with things at the firm level. So there's been a lot of work done within the body of the standard to incorporate the fact that a lot of firms, indeed, obviously most of the large firms, operate under a national or international network agreement and then have specific quality processes aligned with those network agreements. The concerns have come through from regulators over the last many years when this standard's been developed, that both firms and individual engagement teams were placing too much reliance on network requirements and network services. So effectively just saying, well, that's been dealt with at the network level, so I don't have to worry about it. So there's new requirements now that you're required to, as part of your system of quality control, address the network requirements or network services in the context of the system of quality management framework that Renee outlined. It's designed to improve the robustness of the firm's responsibilities when it comes to all the various, how they're complying with the network requirements and network services, but also how that then addresses the individual firm's requirements when it comes to their system of quality management. Essentially, the new requirements emphasise that the firm is responsible for its own system of quality management, so they can place reliance on the network systems and controls, but they have to obviously make sure that they've got the appropriate information and evidence in place to ensure that they're appropriately relying on those controls and that there's no undue reliance on any network requirements or network services coming through. That also extends itself to the use of service providers, again, so different scenario, obviously, with networks, but the same principle, that you can't just effectively have a system of quality control where you outsource the responsibility to a service provider. Whilst you obviously can delegate the requirement to use the service provider to assist you with your system of quality management, you certainly can't just effectively rely on that service provider. And if we think about that, that's consistent with the existing auditing standards framework. You know, the auditor can't just rely on someone else. For example, we can't rely on the use of an expert blindly. We obviously have to do enough work to determine that reliance on that expert is appropriate. So that principle applies here in the context of ISQM1. This is an area that I think will get more exposure when the update is made to ISO 600 as well, the group audit standard. That's currently open for debate at the ISSB level, and their current plan is to release that as an exposure draft by the end of the year. So I think in the context of those of you considering this standard, it's also something to consider when you're evaluating the requirements or the new requirements coming through ISO 600. But to summarise, it's certainly an area of the standard that's been beefed up quite a bit. Okay, the last topic I'm going to go through before I hand back to Sylvia is documentation. And really, again, this is not an area where I would say that the standard is complex. Obviously, the logic of, you have to document your system of quality management, you have to document the objectives, the risks and the responses in accordance with the framework that Renee went through with you previously. That should be pretty straightforward. So what they've done is they call it a two-step approach to documentation, but essentially, ultimately it's saying that you have to document all the principles, which Renee went through, but then for particular areas, specifically the ones that I've been through, there's more specific requirements around documentation. So peppered throughout the standards, there is actually some explicit documentation requirements. So unlike some of the other auditing standards where all the documentation requirements are isolated in one particular part of the standard, you actually do need to make sure that you've gone through the exposure draft to look at where the documentation requirements are. And specifically, the specific requirements relate to the need to document the quality objectives and assess quality risks and responses for each of the areas that we've gone through, and particularly more explicit documentation in relation to the monitoring and remediation processes I went through, and the elements that I mentioned about network and service providers. So essentially you've got the principles-based requirements, which is essentially the documentation of the system, and then the more specific requirements. And again, I look at that in the same way that I look at when you perform an audit. If you think about internal controls, you document your internal controls at a more high level, the internal control framework, the COSO framework, etc. But obviously then when you have explicit requirements you're going to place reliance upon, you then document those in more detail. So I think you'll find that the documentation requirements in ISQM1, whilst they're more explicit and more detailed in the standard, the principles are pretty consistent with what you'd expect from the point of view of when you're doing an audit of the system of quality management. Okay, that wraps up my little section. I'm going to hand back to Sylvia. So once again, if everyone can just hold on for 2 seconds, we'll hand back the control of we'll hand back control to Sylvia. If I can get the mouse to work. Here we go. Back to you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Matthew, and I'm hoping that you all really know how to apply ISQM1. It's quite a mouthful. What I'm going to cover now is the new proposed standard, ISQM2, on engagement quality reviews. So I'm just having trouble changing the slide here. Just bear with me. There you go. Now, the matters that I'm going to talk to you about today is firstly the interrelationship with the ED ISQM1 and ED ISA 220 revised, and then give you a quick overview of the requirements in ED ISQM2. It's to do with the appointment and eligibility of the EQR reviewer, the performance of the EQR review, and the documentation requirements. Now, the requirements for engagement quality reviews are currently in the extant ISQC1 and in ISA 220. Now, as mentioned before, in the system of quality management, the engagement quality review is a response to an assessed quality risk, and ED ISQM1 addresses the circumstances in which an engagement quality review should be performed, which Renee covered in an earlier slide. Now, ED ISQM2 is the new proposed standard that addresses the specific requirements for the appointment and eligibility of the engagement quality reviewer and the performance and documentation of the review. Although there will no longer be requirements for the performance of engagement quality reviews in the proposed ISA 220 revised, ED 220 contains requirements regarding the engagement partner's responsibilities relating to the engagement quality review, which largely focus on how the engagement partner and the engagement team interact with the engagement quality reviewer. Tim will cover that later when he talks to you about ED 220. Now, in response to feedback that the IAASB received in 2015-2016, the requirements in the ED ISQM2 for the appointment and eligibility of the engagement quality reviewer, whether internal or external to the firm, are quite a bit more robust than those in the extant ISQC1. In addition, there's also requirements and application material have been added to address the eligibility of the individuals within the firm that's actually responsible for the appointment of the engagement quality reviewer, the eligibility of individuals to assist the engagement quality reviewer, and the engagement quality reviewer having to be responsible for the performance of the engagement quality review, including that of the work of individuals assisting with the review. There's also limitations on the eligibility of the individual to be appointed as engagement quality reviewer for an engagement for which the individual previously served as the engagement partner. Now, the extant includes requirements on criteria for eligibility that focus on the technical qualifications, including the experience and authority and maintaining objectivity. ISQM2 expands the eligibility requirements, and the application material provides further guidance in determining whether an individual has the competence and capabilities needed to perform the engagement quality review. There is a new explicit requirement that the firm's policies or procedures require that the engagement quality reviewer has sufficient time to perform the review, and it elaborates on how authority may be established through firm culture, policies and procedures to provide the mechanism to address and resolve issues. Now, ISQM2 further requires the EQR to comply with relevant ethical requirements and highlights threats to objectivity that may arise. For example, a threat to objectivity when an individual is appointed as the EQR reviewer immediately after serving as the engagement partner. The IAASB considers that there are no safeguards or other actions that would eliminate that threat. Therefore, it includes a new requirement that the firm has to establish policies and procedures that include limitations on the eligibility of the EQR reviewer. The application material suggests such limitations may be achieved by a cooling-off period for the firm to determine, and it should be at least 2 years for listed entities. Now, this is stricter than the current cooling-off requirements in the Code of Ethics, which allows an engagement partner to become an EQR as long as the cumulative time on the engagement has not exceeded 7 years. ISQM2 also recognizes potential threat when the nature, time, and extent of discussions with the engagement partner create a perception that the EQR is making decisions on behalf of the engagement partner. It requires the firm's policies to address appropriate actions to take in these circumstances. And the firm may also use third-party resources as EQR reviewers, for example, SMPs. And the ED clarifies that the same eligibility requirements apply to any individual to be appointed on those EQR reviews. Now, the IAASB agreed it was necessary to clarify and improve the requirements addressing the performance of engagement quality reviews to enhance their robustness. It affirmed its view that the EQR review provides an objective evaluation of the significant judgments made by the engagement team. It includes a new requirement addressing the involvement at appropriate points in the audit, which will be consistent with when significant judgments are being made by the engagement team, which in the case of audits of financial statements would include significant risks. The IAASB is really interested in hearing your views on whether the requirements imposed on the EQR reviewer are appropriate in light of the responsibilities of the engagement partner. Now, the EQR performance requirements are shown on the slide. Firstly, the EQR reviewer has to read and understand the information obtained from the engagement team and from the firm's monitoring and remediation. Then from there, it has to discuss the significant matters with the engagement partner and then identify areas where the significant judgments are being made. Then review selected documents that support those significant judgments and then evaluate the basis for the engagement team making those significant judgments, and also if they've exercised professional skepticism. But to check to see if there's support for conclusions and whether the conclusions are appropriate. They also have to evaluate if there's been appropriate consultation on difficult and contentious matters and where there's been differences of opinion. It also has to evaluate the basis for the engagement partner's conclusion that the engagement partner has taken overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality on their audit engagement. This is a new proposed requirement in ED 220. The EQR review also has to review for the audit of financial statements. You look at the financial statements and the auditor's report, and if there's been any key audit matters, to look at those as well. In the case of assurance or related services engagement, as to look at the engagement report and also subject matter information. And where the EQR review comes up with any concerns, you have to notify the engagement partner of the concerns. And if the engagement partner does not actually address the concerns or there is disagreement with the EQR reviewer, the reviewer has to escalate it to appropriate individuals if it's not been resolved. With documentation, there are enhanced requirements for the documentation of the engagement quality review. Again, this is a two-step approach, as Matthew has talked about the documentation for ISQM 1. The first step, again, is the overarching requirement for the documentation to be sufficient to enable an experienced practitioner having no previous connection with the engagement to understand what all the nature, time, and extent of the procedures the engagement quality review performed. And then the second step is for specific matters to be documented, which is the names of the engagement quality reviewer and any individuals who assisted with the engagement quality review, and identification of the engagement documentation that had been reviewed, how the engagement quality reviewer actually determined that he or she had fulfilled the ISQM2 requirements, the documentation of the notifications required if any concerns have been raised, and also notification to the engagement partner that the review had been complete and the date of completion of the engagement quality review. I will now hand over to Tim in Australia, who's going to talk about the last piece in the puzzle, ED ISO 220 revised. Okay, Tim, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sylvia. So today I'm going to be talking about quality management at the engagement level. So we've just had an overview from Sylvia, Renee and Matt about what's going on at the firm level and also what's happening with the EQR. Okay, sorry, just waiting for my slide to transition. Okay, so what I'm going to be covering is firstly, the interrelationship with ISQM1 and ISQM2 and how they work together with ISO 220 to manage quality. Also talking about the overall responsibilities of the engagement partner and how they have changed from the extant standard. Also going to cover the strengthening of the relevant ethical requirements in this proposed standard and also about acceptance and continuance and engagement resources. So this first slide shows how ED ISO 220 interacts with ED ISQM1. So we can see that ED 220 operates as part of a broader system of quality management. The top half of the slide relates to the firm level and the bottom half with the engagement level. Responses to quality risks identified at the firm level may be implemented at the firm level or at the engagement level. There is a requirement throughout the standard for two-way communication, for the firm to communicate responses to be implemented at the engagement level and for the engagement team to communicate information to the firm to support the design, implementation and operation of the firm's systems of quality management. So you can see that there's a constant cycle throughout this of identifying and assessing quality risks, implementing responses, whether at the firm level or the engagement level, and then communicating information about the design and implementation back up to the firm level. So like the extant ISO 220, it's premised on the basis that the firm is subject to the ISQMs or national requirements that are at least as demanding. However, there's been a bit of a change in this version of 220 to avoid the risk of engagement teams blindly relying on the firm's system of quality management without considering if it is fit for purpose at the engagement level. There is a slight change to the role of the firm's policies and procedures compared to the extant. In the extant standard, there was a paragraph in the introduction which outlined that the engagement team can rely on the firm's system of quality management unless information provided by the firm or other parties suggests otherwise. This has been deleted in the ED and moved to the application material, where instead of just saying that unless information arises, you can depend, it says the engagement team may depend on the firm's policy and procedures in complying with the requirements in ED 220. So the responsibility has changed now from just relying unless something arises to the engagement partner must now determine whether the system of quality management can be relied upon. For example, the engagement team may depend on the firm's policies and procedures in respect of recruiting, training, information systems. Application material has been added on examples of matters to take into account when determining whether it is appropriate to depend on the firm's policies or procedures. For example, the engagement partner's knowledge or understanding of or practical experience with such policies and procedures, information obtained from the firm through other sources, and other parties about the effectiveness of such policies and procedures. In certain places, there are requirements to comply with the firm's policies or procedures. For example, when evaluating threats to compliance with independence through compliance with the firm's policies or procedures. So something that's quite distinct in this ED is the term shall be satisfied has been used where it refers to the engagement partner responsibility in relation to actions that occur at the firm level, and the phrase shall determine is used when the engagement partner has to take direct actions. So talking about the overall responsibilities of the engagement partner. This diagram illustrates how the engagement partner's overall responsibility to manage and achieve quality on the engagement is demonstrated through sufficient and appropriate involvement throughout the engagement. This overall responsibility includes the first part, which is fulfilling leadership responsibilities. This includes taking actions to create an environment for the engagement that emphasises the firm's culture and the expected behaviours of engagement team members and tasks to other members of the engagement team. The next part is supporting engagement performance, which includes taking responsibility for the nature, timing and extent of direction, supervision and review of the work performed. And the final part is the introduction of a new standback, which requires the engagement partner to determine whether you have been sufficiently and appropriately involved throughout the engagement to be able to take overall responsibility for managing and achieving quality. The standard has an overall stronger emphasis on the public interest context, professional judgment, and exercising professional skepticism to achieve quality at the engagement level. So the standard actually lists impediments to skepticism, auditor biases, and highlights possible actions to deal with them, and other actions such as the removal of reliance on the firm system, which we talked about just before. Importantly, there are proposed revisions to the definition of engagement team, which draws in those performing the audit and any other individuals who perform audit procedures. This now includes service delivery centres who perform audit procedures, individuals from networks or other firms, but explicitly does not include the engagement quality reviewer. In Australia, there's been discussions at the board level about how this expanded engagement team interacts with the requirements of the standard. So, relevant ethical requirements. The extent standard required the engagement partner to remain alert for non-compliance with relevant ethical requirements, to determine appropriate action if they become aware of non-compliance, and to conclude on compliance with independence. The relevant ethical requirements have been strengthened from the extent and requires the engagement partner to firstly understand the ethical requirements, including those relating to independence, determine that other members have been made aware of relevant ethical requirements and the firm's policies and procedures, including those that deal with threats, breaches and responsibilities. The engagement partner has to evaluate any identified threats and to take appropriate action, but also remain alert throughout the engagement. Before signing the audit report, the engagement partner has to determine if ethical requirements have been fulfilled. The ED includes new application material, describes possible actions if non-compliance is indicated, and links to ISO 700 for auditors' report statements on independence. So it's important to get this section of the standard right, as both in Australia and New Zealand, relevant ethical requirements are given legal force. So, acceptance and continuance. It's all about now that the engagement partner has to be satisfied that the firm's policies and procedures in respect of acceptance and continuance have been followed, and if the firm's conclusions on those were appropriate. If the engagement partner becomes aware of information subsequent that may have caused the firm to decline the engagement partner must communicate this to the firm. The firm and the engagement partner may conclude it is appropriate to continue and decide what additional steps are required at the engagement level. For example, assigning more staff or assigning staff with particular expertise. If the engagement partner has further concerns and feel it has not been dealt with appropriately, the firm's policy for resolving differences of opinion may be applicable. Again, this is an incremental change from the extent and hasn't changed too much about how this would apply at an actual engagement. Okay, fun stuff, engagement resources. So, the extant ISO 220 did not explicitly address the need for the engagement partner to be satisfied that sufficient time and resources are available to the engagement team so that it will be possible to perform the necessary work to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence before the reporting deadline. The proposed ED addresses this gap through a new section on human, technological, and intellectual resources. Importantly, the engagement partner is now responsible for determining that there are sufficient and appropriate resources assigned or made available to the engagement partner on a timely basis. The engagement partner is also now responsible for taking appropriate action when insufficient or inappropriate resources in the context of the audit engagement are provided by the firm, and for the appropriate use of resources by the engagement team. There is new application material that describes the appropriate actions if the engagement partner determines that the resources are inappropriate or insufficient. So you can see the blue box, including what's in the red box up there about the engagement partner. So moving on to the engagement performance and what the engagement partner is actually responsible for. So the key things are the engagement partner is now responsible for the nature, timing and extent of direction and supervision of the members of the engagement team and the review of the work performed. They are also required to determine on or before the date of the audit report through a review of audit documentation and discussion with engagement team members if sufficient and appropriate audit evidence has been obtained to support the conclusions reached. The engagement partner must also review documentation at appropriate points in time during the audit engagement, including audit documentation relating to significant matters identified, other areas involving significant judgments, especially those relating to difficult or contentious matters identified during the course of the engagement, and the conclusions reached by the engagement team, and also other matters that the engagement partner's professional judgment are relevant to the engagement partner's responsibility. The engagement partner also has to review final financial statements, the auditor's report, and also the accounts before signing the report. They are also responsible for dealing with differences of opinion and undertaking appropriate consultation throughout the engagement. If there is an engagement quality reviewer, the engagement partner must be satisfied that, firstly, that an engagement quality reviewer has been appointed. The engagement partner is also required to cooperate, which when we've had discussions here in Australia, it seems a bit confrontational with the language. They also must discuss significant matters with the EQR. They also must not date the audit report until the EQR is completed. As you know from the previous section delivered by Sylvia, the engagement quality reviewer part has moved from ISO 220 to a separate standard, ISQM2. So I'm just going to finish off with the documentation requirements. So the exposure draft outlines items that should be included in the documentation. For ED 220, the key documentation is how responsibilities related to relevant ethical requirements were fulfilled and any matters, discussions or conclusions reached about them. Matters identified, relevant discussions and conclusions about the acceptance and continuance of engagements, the nature and scope of any consultations undertaken, and how the conclusions reached in those consultations were implemented during the engagement, and that an EQR has been completed by the appropriate date. So I'm actually going to hand back to Sylvia now to go through the outreach and any questions.
Thank you, Tim. You all will be very happy to know that we're almost at the end of all the slides. Now, I'm just going to cover the outreach plan in New Zealand, and then I'm going to pass back to Matthew, who will cover the outreach planned for Australia. As you can see, we will be holding a number of workshops from Auckland, Taronga, Wellington, and in Christchurch during April. And the focus of the workshops will be on ISQM1, looking at the proposed quality management system for firms. As you've heard, there are 8 components described in the proposals, but we will be focusing in on 1 or 2 of these components because we wouldn't have enough time to do all of them. And the aim of the workshops is for practitioners to work through the components that we select to look at and to discuss and identify possible quality risks to the required quality objectives based on the individual circumstances. And this will be followed by then talking about the required responses that will address the quality risks, including any further required responses. We believe this process will assist in highlighting possible implementation difficulties and areas where further guidance or compelling reason amendments may be necessary. We will then be having a follow-up on the workshops for the small medium practitioners on the 6th of May and a roundtable for the larger firms on the 27th of May to work through the proposals of the quality management standards. Our board will be discussing at their board meeting in June if we should be issuing a New Zealand exposure draft on any compelling reason changes. The one area that we are looking at is to do with the scope of the entities that will be subject to EQR reviews. As you will recall, that ISQM1 talks about the firms having to identify those entities of significant public interest. So we will tell you more about that after the June board meeting. So Matthew, I'm going to hand back to you now, and if you could please tell us about the outreach plan in Australia.
Thanks, Sylvia. Maybe worthwhile, there's only one slide, so how about you control and just, oh no. All right, I've got control now. All right. Once again, it's just taking a little moment to load up the slide, everybody. Okay. So from an Australian perspective, we're running things a little bit differently to New Zealand, but I should share with you all that Sylvia and myself and the two respective teams, technical teams for the NZ-AUASB and the AUASB have been working very, very closely on this, sharing materials. So it doesn't matter which side of the Tasman that you're attending, whilst the actual process by which we reach out to get feedback on these standards may differ, the content and the nature will be very consistent. So particularly for those of you working with firms which obviously have operations on both sides of the Tasman, if you attend the outreach in one area, then, you know, obviously there's no need to go and replicate that on the other side of the Tasman. And likewise, people from your respective firms should be confident that the same material will be being covered, whether you attend a workshop in New Zealand or Australia. Unlike the New Zealand board, however, we in Australia have been a bit lax in getting our exposure drafts out. So let me give a bit of context for that for those listening on the webinar who are from Australia or work with Australian colleagues in respect to that. If you look at the slide at the moment, I'm actually going to drop down to the bottom point and highlight that the exposure draft process that we've done for these standards is different to the way it's been done by the New Zealand Auditing Assurance Standards Board. The Australian Standards Board had some significant concerns with the exposure draft, and subsequently, have chosen to expose the ED in its entirety, consistent with the ISSB exposure draft, but also included an Australian-specific explanatory memorandum associated with each of the standards, which contains a number of Australian-specific questions. So for Australian constituents and stakeholders, we're very keen to get feedback, not only in a general nature on the exposure drafts, which we can then incorporate into our summary that we send back to the ISSB and also share with our ISSB board members. But also, we've flagged a number of concerns which either have an Australian-specific consideration or are elements that our board have a particular concern about and would like explicit feedback on. So the process is a little bit different. It evolves from the process that the Australian board went through when we last exposed a standard, which was the ISA 315 standard. So it's a slightly different way of doing it, but it's an evolution of that. We're confident that going forward, we'll get the process consistent going forward. I suppose it's fair to say that the Australian board is transitioning from exposing the international standards when they were completed, which is what we used to do, to now exposing them concurrently with the ISSB, which of course the New Zealand board has done for some time. So it takes a little while to get our board members moving across and also, getting through the process to ensure that we're having the right amount of input at the right time. So from an Australian perspective, I want to again emphasise those on the webinar who are representing one of the Australian firms. Please, even if you're not intending to give feedback on the international standard because it might be done through your global or network firm, we ask all Australian participants to still look at our exposure memoranda to ensure that they're addressing, if relevant, any of the Australian specific elements that have been raised as part of the exposure process by the AUASB. As Sylvia mentioned, the NZ AUASB will be going through a process to evaluate, do they then issue a separate ED covering the Australian specific requirement, New Zealand specific requirements. Essentially, what we've tried to do is the same thing, but just done it a bit, I suppose, tried to address it in advance. So with that context in mind, the Australian timing of all the various workshops and other activities to get feedback is still being finalised from our perspective. We've only just finalised our explanatory memoranda last week, so they were sent out on the 26th of March. We will be running specific targeting sessions like New Zealand with our large firms and network firms, and we'll also be running a series of roundtables in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. We are looking to run those workshops or those roundtables in conjunction with getting feedback on the upcoming IWSB discussion paper on audits of less complex entities, which is due to be published by the IWSB in mid-April. So logically, our intention is to get that approved and then kill two birds with one stone with our outreach timing, so that representatives of the Australian firms can address both of these topics at the same time. Bear in mind that there are a number of themes which will be consistent within across both the quality management standards and that LCE discussion paper. And the final point I'll raise is, like the New Zealand board, we will be running a webinar in mid or late May, the date to be determined. That webinar will, unlike this webinar, be very much driven by getting feedback on the exposure drafts and talking about some of the issues that have come up in our outreach and getting additional feedback on that to inform the AUSB submission. So that's to capture those people who are unable to attend one of the other outreach activities that we'll be running throughout late April and through to May. So Sylvia, thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, but before I do, on behalf of everyone in Australia and those associated with the AUSB, my thanks to you for doing the bulk of the preparation today, and also to the New Zealand XRB for hosting the webinar. So I will hand back to you to wrap things up.
I've just been, thank you, Matthew. I've just been looking at whether there's been any questions, but there's no questions have actually been raised during the webinar. But please, you still have time to do that. If you do have any questions, please let us know and we will address them and get back to you as soon as we can. Just want to say a big thank you for listening to the webinar today. Hopefully it has explained all the new provisions to you. And like I said, please let us know if you have any further questions, either to the New Zealand Auditing and Assurance Standards Board staff or to the Australian Audit Assurance Standards Board staff. We also want to really encourage you to take part in one or more of the many outreach events being held in New Zealand and in Australia. This is your opportunity to let the IAASB know of any issues you may foresee in implementing the proposals. Once the international standards are finalised, it becomes very difficult to amend the standards for application in New Zealand and in Australia, given our board's strategic approach to only amend the standards when there are compelling reasons to do so. Now, if you are unable to attend any of the outreach events, please just drop us a line about any issues you may have with the proposals. It does not have to be a formal or complete submission. An email on a specific issue will do, and we will listen and take everything into account that you feedback to us. So I want to let you know that a recording of the webinar will be available on both the AUASB and the XRB websites later today. And also a big thank you, Matthew, to you and your staff for participating in this. It's been a great help, because I would have been really hoarse at this point in time if I had to cover all these many slides. So thank you all. Thanks again and goodbye.